or good evening, other part of the world. We continue our session on drafting resolution decision making in the time of COVID era in the United Nations. We had a very good discussion with Professor Harry Johnson and Sonia Elliott yesterday. We will continue our conversation about the different aspects of the drafting resolutions, which are the most crucial ones. These are related to decision-making process. What is the rules for the quorum, for the revision of amendments, explanation of vote before or after the vote, the procedural motions. Many questions was raised yesterday about say. And then at one, Mr. Kenji Nakano, who is the head of the General Assembly Affairs Branch, will illustrate to us how the General Assembly is conducting business in this period of time in which the General Assembly is not meeting in a face-to-face format. That will allow you the opportunity to have a conversation through Larry with him about any preparations or any decision making, how resolutions will be adopted in General Assembly, when it will start, what will be the modalities in the main committees, and things like that. You can ask also how has been the decision making process during the last 3 months, for example, because the General Assembly has been meeting virtually and certain decisions has been made, how they agree on that. So that kind of inputs that may illustrate to you how this pandemic has shifted the working methods of the General Assembly. And normally when those shifts happens in any resolution, or when the General Assembly adopts a decision for the first time in any particular issue, there is a language he says, these do not constitute a precedent for continuing to do this like a practice. But when something is done for the first time, you always remember, and when you have in the same situation in the future, you always invoke, in the past we did that, why we don't do it today? So it's a learning process for everybody. I hope I don't put it too much heat. Larry Johnson presentations early this morning about these comments. I'm going to yield to him for the interest of time. You will be the whole morning with him, with Kenji. And I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to say that, and I know Larry will take care of that at the end of the session also during the closing remarks, is that if you are interested in the guidelines, please send us an email to start to compile a list to make a kind of prioritization of the people who is interested on that. So again, welcome back. I hope you enjoy it. And Larry, I'm going to yield to you and thank you once again for your time with us this morning.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marco. And first, as a housekeeping matter, if when I'm speaking, I lose connectivity or it's garbled, if you could let me know, tell me that I need to repeat, interrupt me so that I am able to communicate completely. And second, I want to repeat what Marco said. It's a little bit like, are you paper? What you mean by non-paper is paper.
Could you repeat, Harry, the whole thing? Could you repeat that we lost communication?
Oh. Okay. What I was saying is that it's typical in the UN, you can have a non-paper, but of course it's a piece of paper. So the meaning is simply that it's an informal text, but they call things what, of course it's a piece of paper. And so also with regard to a precedent, that's a favorite phrase, which I think non-lawyers like to use to try to say, well, okay, well, we're doing it this one time. I've agreed to it on an exception basis, but don't expect me to agree to it next week for something else. So they say it doesn't constitute a precedent. But of course, once something happens, it happens. Of course, it's a precedent. So it's one of those sort of typical UN diplomatic, some would say nonsensical things, but it's all political and there's a purpose behind it. If you know the purpose behind it, then you can understand that it's not so, the terminology is not so important. It's just, watch out, we're doing it this time, but don't expect us to do it again. But of course, later you can always say, well, you've done it once, why not do it again? So now we're going to move into decision making. And in fact, it brings me back to something yesterday we talked about, which was the 2/3 majority. And if I could ask Leo, if you could put up rules 83, 84, and 85 again, that reflect there we are, 83 and 85. 83 gives you the list of what matters are considered important questions that need a 2/3 majority. And then it's rule 85, which gives you what happens if you want to add to that list of categories. So at that point, the General Assembly can decide that this particular question, and this happened many years ago when the question of representation of China, when Taiwan was representing China for many years, the U.S. and the West would have the General Assembly decide that the question of the representation of China was an important question, which is not listed in the charter. So they took a decision, and that decision is taken by a majority of the members. 83 and 85 are directly from the charter. And to give you an idea of how there are different rules between committees and plenary, this is rule 85 is for the plenary. If you jump, and it has in square brackets, rule 25. So if you could switch to rule 125, which is how you vote in the committees, you see a big difference. If you can find rule 125, Palaio, down the line, there we go. Oh, no, not yet. Yeah, here we go. So look at that. Rule 125 is just decisions shall be made 2/3. Nothing there at all. So that makes it quite clear that the important question issue only arises in the plenary and is not applicable in the committees. And in the committees, in the main committees, it's very clear, and in the subsidiary organs too, the standard is voting, majority requirement is a simple majority of those present and voting. And rule 126, and it's the same in plenary, in rule 86, it defines what you mean by present and voting. It just means affirmative and negative, and you don't count the abstentions. And as I said yesterday, and you have had a few cases of this where you have a huge number of abstentions, and you can have a resolution or a motion adopted by 25 in favor and 10 against and 170. And as I said, that's opposed to what's in the Security
We
Council.
lost Larry, that last part that you mentioned, if you don't mind repeating.
Sure. So in the assembly, you can have a resolution or proposal adopted by just a few members. You need a quorum, we'll get to that, but you can have a resolution adopted by 25 votes in favor, 10 votes against, and 170 abstentions. And that's absolutely the opposite of the Security Council, where the charter provides that you need 9 votes for anything to be adopted. 9 yes votes. So your strategies are different in the two bodies, okay? So from that, we'll jump to decision-making in general, unless there are any questions on that. I'm putting up the chat. No, anyway, on decisions in general, only members of the UN can vote. That's what member states pay for. They're a member of the club. They've ratified the charter, parties to the charter as a treaty body, and they're entitled to the full rights of membership. So observers or others cannot vote. There's one exception, particularly for those of you who are following international criminal justice, where the statutes have provided, the statute provides for election of judges of the mechanism for the two international criminal tribunals to also include observer states who can then vote. So State of Palestine and Holy See are put on the floor of the General Assembly and vote for judges for that body. Otherwise, all other voting is by members only. And we discussed Article 19 and the loss of vote in the General Assembly if you're in arrears for 2 calendar years, and how that operates and how you can ask for an exception for that from the General Assembly. The one thing, once we get into how it operates on the ground, you have a proposal, and then if the sponsors do not want, get suggestions for change from others, and if they don't accept those suggestions and therefore revise their text might be subject to an amendment from the floor. It could be a hostile amendment, or someone wants to add something and the sponsors don't want it to be added to their text. It's something different or opposed to. So then you have an amendment. And it's
Sorry, Laurie,
circulated
we're
just like
losing you
a
again.
proposal as an L document. I'm sorry. I may have to move location if it continues this way. What I was saying is, if you have an amendment to a text, and the sponsors do not accept it as a revision, then the amendment may proceed to a vote. And that's the main thing, is you take up amendments first. You have a main proposal and maybe you have 2 or 3 different amendments, and then you have to take up the amendments before you take up the main proposal. That's a basic in terms of parliamentary practice. And then you take up the proposals in the order of submission. At the end of the day, you will have a vote, and the presiding officer will ask for, everybody uses the electronic voting now. And then you need to press the green button for yes. And the second, I see a message that it's a better connection if I close the video. So I've done that now. So hopefully it will be better now. And anyway, you push the green button for yes, you press the red button for no, and you press the yellow button for abstention. The chairperson will ask you to do that. All those in favor, please do this. All those against, please press red. All those who wish to abstain, please. And then the chairperson should say, if he follows his notes from the secretariat correctly, he should say, will all delegations check the voting board, the electronic voting board, to make sure? And there's a pause. And that's the chance for you to change your vote if you want to. If you see that you intended to vote green, yes, but in fact you made a mistake and you voted no, then you can switch your vote, or you can switch to abstention. You can switch between the 3 options during that pause. And then the chairperson will say, have all delegations concluded their voting? Have all delegations checked that their vote is accurately reflected? And then he will say the voting is now closed. And then the machine is locked. And at that point on, you cannot change your vote. At that point, the totals should appear on the board, and they will be announced by the presiding officer, who will say the results of the vote are as follows, X, X, X. And then he will say the required majority is such and such. He'll indicate the number of those present and voting, and he will indicate from a table that is used. This means that the required majority is the following number, and the resolution is adopted or not adopted, and then he bangs the gavel. And at that point, it's finished. You cannot change your vote. Before that, if someone tries to change their vote after it's been locked, but before it's announced, you can have a point of order from the floor where a delegate will bang his pen or get the attention of the presiding officer and say, point of order, point of order. For some reason, the machine has not recorded my accurate vote. Please change it. And as long as the president has not, even if it has to be done by hand. So you can change your vote before the president or the presiding officer, the chair, announces the results. But once he announces the results and says the resolution is adopted, that's it. There's no procedure for recounts or for changing the vote after that. So that's how it works in the General Assembly and the committees. Sometimes there's a way to reconsider a vote, but that's a whole separate procedure. I'll give you an example. In one of the committees, there had been a request to have a recorded vote, and that's almost automatic in most committees now, but in the past you needed to ask for it. And you still, if you want to make sure you get a printout of how countries voted to send back or to analyze, make sure that it's going to be a recorded vote. And you don't need to announce who that member state is. The chair just says a recorded vote has been requested. We'll proceed to the vote. In this case, the Secretariat forgot to do that. And you had the vote and it was announced, and then there was no printout. At which point there was a procedural discussion about, well, now what are we going to do? I've asked for a printout, a recorded vote. I need that. We need that. So it was then decided by unanimous consent. Everybody agreed to do a reconsideration of the proposal, and so it then becomes a new vote. The old vote was not erased. It's still in the record. There's just no indication of how people voted. But then the committee said, okay, we've all agreed we all want a recorded vote. So then there is a rule on reconsideration where you need a 2/3 majority in order to reconsider a decision that's need to do if there's been an error, for example, and you need to do it again. The quorum is how many people need to be in the room before a meeting begins and before a resolution is put to the vote. The rule is 67. If we could put that up. In the plenary, once we get to it, there we are. 67 says that this is the plenary. He can declare a meeting open and permit the debate when at least 1/3 of the members are in the room. So that's just to hear speeches and to hear discussion. You don't need a majority for that. But the next sentence indicates that you need a majority of the membership before any decision is taken. Okay. In the committee, in the committee's Rule 108, it's slightly different in that the chair of a committee can open a meeting and start the debate, discussion, speeches with only one quarter present in the room. But it follows the plenary, the basic, which is that you need a majority of members in order to take a decision. So how do you determine a quorum? How do you know there are enough people in the room? Well, the responsibility is in the hands of the president or in the chairperson, the chair of the committee, together with the secretariat. So the secretariat and the chair should always, particularly before they start a meeting where there are votes going to be taken, should ascertain that there's enough people in the room to start the voting. They have to determine on their own. They don't take a poll, although that has been suggested sometimes, to make sure there's at least a majority of people in the room. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to vote. It has to be the presence of a majority. Because the last thing you need in the General Assembly is for a vote to take place, and the vote indicates that there's only 30 people, 30 delegates in the room. And that's not a good idea. So that's how the quorum works. And sometimes a president will, or a chair will say, I'm sorry, we're not going to take up resolution so-and-so today or this morning or at this time because we're still short of a quorum. And you can have delegates who aren't sitting in their seat, but are in the back of the room having consultations, but they still count because they're in the room. So that's how you begin a meeting. And I think these days, I think in the general committee, they will recommend that both in plenary and the committees, the chair can begin a meeting even if only a quarter of the membership is there. Of course, if you're the first speaker, you don't like to speak in front of an audience of 3 delegates. But on the other hand, the chairs it's stressed to the chairs that they should try to be efficient and use their time wisely and begin meetings on time. So chairs will be pushing very hard to start the meetings more or less on time, no matter how many people are in the room. Let me stop here. And yes, if you have an equally divided, we'll get to that in a second. When you have, there's a question about an equal vote. What happens if there's a tie? For the most part, particularly in the committees. Well, anyway, I said we'll get to that. So why don't we wait for that, for equally divided results? As far as the next question, can a request be made to the chair to mention the name of the delegation who requested the vote? A request can be made, but the chairman will either say there's no requirement for that. Legally, you don't need to know. That's a right of membership. If you're a member and you want a recorded vote, you have a right to do that. That's not subject to anybody's approval. You're a sovereign state and you want to see how everybody votes, you get to see that. And you get to see how you vote to make sure it's recorded properly. Sometimes the chair may run to the requesting state or someone to vote. I don't understand why states do that, because so what? Every state has a right to request it. So obviously it's a political issue. Another question, is there a limit on how many times a proposal can be voted upon if it has continued to be denied? Yes, no, once it's defeated, that's it. So if you want to go back to it, it's a reconsideration, and you need 2/3 to open it up again. Once the proposal has been voted upon and either adopted or not adopted, that's it. That's the final result. And only if the committee decides to reconsider it by a 2/3 majority can you go back to it. Now, points of order. Points of order are in Rule 71. The plenary rule. And 71 indicates the procedure. A point of order is made, the president rules on it, and then there could be a challenge, an appeal against the ruling of the chair and president, and then it can be overruled by a majority of, by a simple majority. Now, the problem is points of order are used for all kinds of different reasons. And Palaio, if I could ask you to go to the annexes of the rules of procedure. I think it's page 74 to 76 of the latest version of the rules of procedure.
Which
And
annex would you like me to open?
Well, let's see. It's annex. Just a minute. No, it's a big one. Annex 4. Annex 4. And it's paragraph
Probably, yeah.
paragraph 79. Here we are. So, because there was confusion over the years, what true points of order were and how to distinguish them, this was included in a report of rationalization of the procedures of the GA, and it explains that points of order are really all kinds of different things. What the rule is concerned is the classic true point of order, where a delegate will bang his placard or get the attention of the chair, interrupt the chair, in fact, normally. Sometimes they do it politely, but otherwise, a point of order is raised as an interruption. And it is designed to bring to the attention of the chair that something is not working properly. For example, if a chair says, now we're going to vote on the resolution on a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. And the week before, the committee had decided they would not take that up until 3 weeks' time. So a delegate would say, point of order, Mr. Chair, we have decided not to take that up today. We decided to take that up 3 weeks from now. So may I please request that you revise your statement. So it's, in other words, it's bringing to the attention of the chair, or you could bring it attention to the chair, point of order, this is a closed meeting, but I see the press and the public have been allowed in. So we need to bring this matter back to order. In those cases, the chair will then consider what has been raised and will make a ruling and will say, yes, you're right. We have decided this is a closed meeting, no press are allowed, and therefore so and so. Or the presiding officer can say, no, I don't remember us deciding to do that, and the meeting is therefore open. At which point the delegate would say, well, I think you're incorrect. I have the record of the meeting where we decided all these matters, all discussions on this agenda would be closed. And therefore I appeal your ruling. And you can overrule the presiding officer. The way the rule reads, what is put to the vote is in fact the challenge. A representative the appeal shall be immediately put to the vote. So there's to be no discussion, which makes it very difficult. And the president's ruling shall stand unless overruled by a majority of the members present and voting. So, and that of course is a very unfortunate situation and a contentious situation where someone is challenging the president. So if you're going to raise a classical point of order, you have to make sure you have your facts correct. And you can do it politely and say, I'm sorry, Mr. President, we've decided not to discuss this matter today. We have scheduled it for tomorrow. At which point the president may say, thank you very much. I appreciate you reminding me of that. I had forgotten that. You're absolutely right. We will discuss it tomorrow. End of story. Or the president can say, no, you're absolutely wrong. I never agreed to that. We never agreed to that. And we're going to take it up now. So then you challenge a president, and then you try to get votes to overrule him, and it's very quick. There's to be no discussion. Normally that doesn't work. The president will always want, if he's being challenged the way he is, and you have to think politically. Do you want to challenge this individual? He's not just a presiding, or she's not just a presiding officer or chairperson. She's a delegate of a country. So if you're going to challenge that person, it's a political matter too, that you're challenging someone who normally was the delegate of country X. So actually points of order classical points of orders are not usual because of the political implications, and because normally chairpersons are correctly advised by the secretariat and try to do the right thing. But otherwise, points of order are more, the normal use of a point of order is to just get the floor. And that is to explain the differences between different points of order are explained in this provision that you have in front of you in the annexes. So a point of order is to make a procedural motion. So you'll have a delegate that will say, bang, 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 Mr. Chair, I move under Rule 74 that the Assembly take no action on the proposal in document L25. So it's not a challenge to the president, and the president is not being asked to make a ruling. The point of order is used just to get the floor, to make the procedural motion, because you're not on the speaker's list. The speaker's list are those that are making normal speeches or making introductions of resolutions. But procedural motions can come at any time, and therefore that's a point of order is basically to get the floor. And the third way, the third use of point of order is just to seek a point of information. So in fact, it's called a point of order. In fact, you're asking the chair for a clarification or for a point of order. If the chair has indicated when the committee is going to convene and you were not in the room or you didn't hear, you could say, point of order, Mr. Chair, can you please repeat, when are we meeting next? Or what time are the consultations going to be held? You're actually interrupting because you need a point of information. That's all. So that's why be careful when you use a point of order. I mean, careful, but know in what context you're making it. And be aware of this particular paragraph in the annexes, which go through the different uses of points of order. So that's points of order. And it's the same both in plenary and in the committees. Points of order, it can get confusing sometimes in terms of what is actually put to the vote. And here you'll get a point of order on a point of order. If somebody has a classical point of order and and the chairperson has ruled, and the delegate making the point of order doesn't like the ruling and wants to challenge it, they go to the rule and try to appeal it and say, no, I don't agree with you. So then the president has to put to the vote something. And at that point, you're probably going to have people on the floor saying, point of order, what are we voting on? Which is one of the worst cases you can imagine in terms of a committee or an assembly conducting itself, is if you have confusion on the floor. The rule says appeals shall be immediately put to the vote, and the president's ruling shall stand unless overruled by a majority. So what is put to the vote? The way the rule is written, it's in favor of the president. So what is put to the vote is not the president's ruling. You put to the vote the challenge, the appeal, the objection. Country X has said, no, you are wrong, Mr. President. You need to be overruled. So then the committee has to vote on the delegate X position, president's ruling. And that's how it works. But as I said, normally it doesn't happen very much. And if it does, you're going to have some procedural chaos if the presiding officer, the president, is not in control, and particularly if it's by surprise. Anything by surprise in UN meetings runs the risk of chaos and confusion because it hasn't been well prepared, and the presiding officer may be unaware of how to handle it, so on and so forth. So those are points of order. Next, we have the no action motion. And because it's more or less I mentioned yesterday, the one that is used the most. So if you can put up, go back to the rules themselves, Leo, to Rule 74. This rule, to give you a background, the way it reads, it looks like it was originally designed to postpone consideration of a proposal for maybe a few weeks or a few months, because it says during the discussion of any matter, a representative may move the adjournment of the debate on the item under discussion. It doesn't say until when, and we'll get to that in a second. And then it goes through how you deal with that motion. But first of all, the question is, you make the motion, and in the 70s, I believe it was somebody thought of the idea of adjourning the debate on the item sine die. In other words, you shelve it. Okay. So instead
Hello,
of saying,
Laurie. We didn't get that last sentence. So you can repeat.
sure. So in the 70s, it was devised an interpretation that would say you could adjourn the debate indefinitely during that session. So in other words, you shelve the proposal for the rest of the session. It's only good for one session. So that became known as the no action motion. So today you will hear it invoked by a delegate proposing that a particular proposal, that there be no action taken on a particular proposal or amendment, period. And that will be considered a Rule 74 motion, even though it doesn't say challenges to that from the floor, and there were legal opinions, and the General Assembly and the committees voted on various rulings, and it's now established practice that in fact you can move the adjournment of the debate on an item, which means a proposal, an amendment, anything except a motion, another procedural motion. You can make a motion on a motion, but you can do that and until the end of the session. So that's why I said yesterday that this is one way where you can get rid of a proposal that you don't like. Now, conceptually, you can say, well, why do you do that? Why don't you just vote on the proposal? Because it's a very different proposition, and that's why Rule 74 is very popular. Because you can say, look, I don't want to discuss this matter now during this session. It may put delegations in an embarrassing or an awkward situation, or they don't want to take a position on the proposal. So rather than being forced to vote yes, no, or even abstain, they would like to say, we want this to go away. It's not appropriate. It's not timely. And this is not the point in the life of the General Assembly. We want to take a position on this question. So we will postpone it indefinitely this session. Of course, it can come back the next session. So that's the no action motion. What is unique about some of these procedural motions is the drafters decided, when you make these motions, of course, it can be very, it's contentious. So in order to save time, they limit the number of people who can speak. So for Rule 74, you only are allowed 4 speakers total, 2 in favor of the motion and 2 against the motion, at which point the motion shall be immediately put to the vote. Now this creates a challenge for the presiding officer and for the secretariat, Because immediately when someone says, I move under Rule 74 that the committee take no action on the draft resolution contained in L35, the presiding officer will say, okay, we'll forget about the speakers list because that interrupts the speakers list. We now are in Rule 74. He or she reads the rule. This is what is now governing what we have to do. So now I open the floor for the discussions on the motion. What is probably the easiest, and it depends on the chair and the secretariat, is for the chair to say, okay, now I'm opening the floor to two speakers in favor of closure. And then he'll cut it off and say, I've heard the two people in favor of no action. Now I will listen, I will give the floor to two speakers against. And then we have that. What can be confusing is if he doesn't divide it and he says, okay, who wants to speak? And then he has to take care and make sure he's listening to who speaks in favor, who speaks against, so that then he can stop further debate and can say, no, we've already had two in favor. I need to give it to someone else now. So again, these kinds of things should be prepared ahead of time as contingency matters by any secretary and any chair, so that they're ready and their notes are ready in case someone invokes Rule 74. It's always best to inform the chair and the secretariat if you're going to do that. You may not strategy and not get the word out to try to keep it confidential, but if you don't inform the president or the chair, the secretariat, you run the risk of chaos and the chair being not being adequately prepared to run it. So once that happens and you have the vote, you have two in favor, two against, no more debate. Immediately go to the vote. And then after the vote, the presiding officer will say, the no action motion, for example, has been carried. Therefore, we will take no further action on this matter. What's interesting, and this is just a footnote, you have the same rule in the Security Council rules of procedure, but in the Security Council rules of procedure, it actually said indefinitely. It actually says, or, to adjourn the debate on the matter indefinitely. So probably in the Security Council and brought it into the General Assembly by interpreting the rule to mean indefinite adjournment. In the Council, this is rarely, if ever, used, but it's there. Now, let me see how many questions do I have. Palayo, can you send some questions my way? Or read them to me?
Yes, 1 second.
Sure.
We have here, I think you didn't address them in the previous one. Could you please clarify again what constitutes a quorum? Is the quorum necessary only for voting or for even starting a meeting?
Okay, yeah, that is fairly, that's an easy one to deal with. If you look at Rule 67, you'll see the answer. There are different quorums depending on the purpose. If the purpose is just to open a meeting, to have a discussion, then under the quorum rule in plenary, you only need a third. In the committees, only 1/4 to start the meeting and to have a discussion. But in order to take a decision, you need a majority in the room. Okay.
Then we also have another question that mentions, can votes take place on proposals without the state delegates who drafted the proposal being present?
Yes. It's not a good idea because you need to be present in order to vote for your own proposal. So in your negotiation sessions or your meetings of the co-sponsors, when you're thinking of strategy, you will make sure that all the co-sponsors know that the vote is scheduled on next Wednesday at 3 p.m. and make sure everybody's in their seats in order to vote in favor of our proposal. But legally, there's no requirement for that.
Okay. Then we also have if can votes directed at a specific paragraph, sentences, or words be denied by the creators and or co-sponsors of the resolution.
No, that we'll be getting to that. That's a separate vote. We'll be getting to that in a second. But there is a procedure by which a delegate can ask for a separate vote on a paragraph, on a section, and on particular words in a resolution. And then we'll review how the rule works on that, because it's the committee that decides whether or not to have a specific vote or not. Once the committee begins taking action on your proposal, it's no longer your proposal. So other questions?
Yes, we have from the representative of Iraq a question which says, in case a proposal or a motion submitted by each delegation for action by the plenary in the same day of the said session, is it possible for the president to move ahead with that proposal since it's being submitted upon short time?
Let me get the chat so I can see exactly what I didn't quite follow. In case a proposal on a motion submitted in the same day for action is possible. That's the 24-hour rule. Yes, we'll get to that in a second. There is a rule. It's in Rule 78. In fact, if you want to put it up, where it says that a committee or the assembly should not take action on a proposal, vote proposal, unless it has been made available, circulated the day before. It's in Rule 78. It's called the 24-hour rule, but it really doesn't say 24 hours. It says the day before. So technically, if a resolution is circulated at 11 p.m., it could be taken up the next day at 10 a.m. But the main reason for that is, of course, principally for interpretations or translation, to make sure that the text, particularly if it's a long text, complicated text, it's made available in all 6 languages. So that's why there's a 24-hour rule. Could you put up the Rule 78 by any chance?
Yeah, I'm sharing it right now. Let me know if you can see.
What I need to do is get out of chat. Sorry. My mistake. Yeah, there we are. It says normally in writing, okay? So this means that, and it's the same rule, I believe, in the committees too. What it means is the committee can always waive that, or the plenary. So if you have a very short proposal and it's only 5 or 6 lines, a president or a chairman could say, well, do we really need to wait for the written text? Today is our last day. Can I ask the assembly to proceed to waive the 24-hour requirement? Then you could have a procedural debate, yes or no. But that rule can and often is waived if you have a very short proposal or a short amendment. And by the way, it says amendments don't have to be 24 hours. It says the president may permit the discussion and consideration of amendments, even though they have not been circulated or have only been circulated the same day. Okay. So it depends. You can have an amendment which is 5 pages long, and someone could say, no, that's a very complicated amendment. I need to check with my capital. I mean, that's the reason also for interpretation, or for translation, sorry, is that you need to send if it's a complicated text or controversial, you need to send it back to your capital. Okay. So any other questions that I've missed?
We do have another question just written in the chat. It reads, could we access voting history lists by country on past resolutions if there is one document that reflects this voting history list by country?
I'm sorry, is this the, can we access voting history lists by country?
Yes, on past resolutions.
You can access, yes, indeed, but in one document, no. I don't, that I know of. I think you have to go to the General Assembly official records. The best is the verbatim records. So you need to do research on each resolution. I don't know of any such list, but perhaps if you could save that question for this afternoon with Kenji Nakano, he may know if the library or UN archives has somewhere developed a history country by country, how they've voted over the years for various resolutions. Otherwise, you have to do your own research basically through the verbatim records, which will indicate the country by country, the recorded votes. Okay.
We also
Maybe.
have, Larry, if you want to go to the next session, or we can address this last question.
Well, the other question was on divided votes. So on this, we'll take a second and deal with that, even though we were talking about announcing the results. So it is a timely question. Rule 95 to begin with. Where that talks about the plenary. There's a difference here between plenary and committees. If in the plenary a vote is equally divided on a resolution, we're not talking about elections here, we're talking about resolutions. A second vote shall be held at a subsequent meeting within 48 hours of the first vote. I don't recall that ever happening in plenary, but that involves a second vote. And if the second vote also results in a tie, the proposal is regarded as rejected. Now, if you could go to Rule 133. In the committees, it's much simpler and is basic that if you have a tie, the motion is defeated. The proposal is defeated. For anything to be adopted, you need a majority. You need half plus one or over the half mark. You can't have a tie and declare that to be a winner. Doesn't work logically either. So if a vote is equally divided, the proposal shall be regarded as rejected. That's the answer to that one. So let me go back to Rule 74, if I could, Lyle. Yeah, because there is sometimes confusion between Rule 74 and 75. '75 is closure of the debate. So don't confuse the two. Closure of the debate is in fact the opposite of adjournment of the debate. Adjournment of the debate, no action. And closure of the debate is we've heard enough speakers. We've heard enough speakers. We don't want to go on with this speakers list, which takes us on another 5 days. We want to close the debate and move directly to the vote. So that's what closure of the debate is. It's very rare and I haven't really seen it used properly very often at all, because it's a very unpopular move. If you're doing that, you're cutting off the speakers, and those speakers are delegates. Now, maybe those delegates you already know you don't like, or are not your friends, or are already opposed to your proposal. But why do you want to get those people unhappy with you? Because all of those people on the list have speeches that they have been instructed to give, right? So in fact, the rule is tilted against it, because if you look at it, it says, once somebody makes this procedural motion, permission to speak is only accorded to two against it. You can't even speak in favor of the motion once it's been made. So that's why it's rarely used, but I bring it up is there's often confusion between 74 and 75, and they have to be separated. So when we look at what is next is Rule 76, suspension or adjournment of the meeting. And this also needs to be clarified because often there's confusion here. And I don't know why the rule was written this way back when, in the 40s, I suppose, where an actual motion for suspension or adjournment of the meeting are not to be debated, but are immediately put to the vote. Well, if you can imagine, that doesn't work. That doesn't work in practice. If it hasn't been already discussed in consultations, and if it's a surprise move that someone, if there's chaos on the floor or if it's confusing and someone says, let's get out of this, we need to have consultations or we need to take a break, suspend the meeting, you know, and it's thrown out as a motion, the president or the presiding officer, to have him say, okay, we have to vote on that, we can't even discuss it, is frankly impractical. So we would normally advise delegates not to make a formal proposal under Rule 76, but rather, particularly if it's an idea that is just being floated in order to assist the conduct of business, you have a point of order and you ask the chair, I suggest we take 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour for informal consultations to discuss how we proceed. And it's a suggestion. So normally we would suggest that a presiding officer say, I take it that that's not a formal motion, but that's a suggestion. Sometimes the presiding officer will, on his own, and the presiding officer will say, I need to consult. I've got 5 different procedural motions on my table. I have to figure out how to proceed. I adjourn the meeting for 30 minutes in order to consult with the Office of Legal Affairs or the Secretariat. So, we would normally advise, please don't use that as a formal motion unless you want an immediate vote and you're confident that you will win an immediate vote. Okay? Rule 77 gets us really into the weeds because there are various motions. You cannot make a no action motion against a motion to adjourn. You cannot make procedural motions on procedural. So they are made in an order, and this is the order in which the presiding officer, in 77, the presiding officer takes them up. You're on that amendments, this has to do with circulation, and also has to deal with the 24-hour rule. We've discussed that. And Rule 81, if we could go to that. '81 coming up. This was the reconsideration that we discussed before, where once a proposal has been adopted or rejected, that answers some of your questions. It may not be reconsidered at the same session. It's already done, unless by a 2/3 majority, the committee or the plenary decides to reconsider it. And there again, there's a restriction on the number of speakers. It will be permission to speak will be accorded only to 2 speakers opposing the motion. So from there, we move straight into voting. And this is an important matter when you see Rule 82. Doesn't say consensus there, does it? Consensus is nowhere mentioned in the charter, nowhere mentioned in the rules of procedure. So if you have attempts to require consensus, normally the legal office would say you can't do that because as part of your rights of membership, you have the right to 1 vote. And if you want to vote and you're taking a decision, you have a right to exercise that vote. So consensus is encouraged, all efforts are made towards consensus, that kind of language in Rule 82 comes straight from the Charter and therefore cannot be changed. We've discussed Rule 83, we've discussed Rule 86, and we've come to a recorded vote. Method of voting is in Rule 87. Where it says in B, 87B, when you're dealing with mechanical, that's all we do these days. Any representative may request a recorded vote. It doesn't say that has to be publicized. Any representative can request, as long as it's a representative, that's it. And then Rule 88 goes on to say, while you're doing the voting, no points of order are allowed unless they have to do with the voting itself. Rule 89 is dealing with the question proposals, where you see a representative may move that parts of a proposal will be voted on separately. And if I'm sorry for the construction behind, if you can hear me. The motion for division has to be voted on if there's been an objection, and you have the procedure that's set out there. And Article 90 has the rule on how you vote on amendments. But this is another thing you need to bear in mind if you get into a situation you have several amendments to the same proposal. And you could. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it can get very complicated. Because instead of the normal rule on proposals, which is whatever comes first, whatever is submitted first, for amendments, the rule is quite different. And the rule, in fact, is extremely difficult to apply. Again, it's one of those rules that frankly should be changed. I can understand the idea is in the amendments, you should take what is the most radical first. So whatever amendment is called furthest removed from substance, from the original proposal, you take that up first, and then you go down the list and you end up with those amendments that are more technical and do not gut or undermine the basic proposal. But that's a very difficult question. That's a matter of judgment. And chairs and secretariats over the years have had enormous difficulties in making those kinds of substantive judgments. So what we normally suggest, and committees normally have no problem with it, is a chair will say, rather than going through the Rule 90 interpretation and judgments, I will take up each paragraph separately as we go through it. So he will first take up amendments to, or she will take up amendments to the operatives, to the preambular paragraphs. You know, he'll say, fine, we have 3 amendments to 3 different preambular paragraphs, and you take them up one by one in the order in the paragraph. So that's what we suggest for voting on amendments. I believe in terms of, we have explanations or a vote I skipped over, but let's go back to Rule 88. And can you hear me, or is there too much construction? I'll move.
It is pretty big, pretty no,
it's right outside.
If you have another space, it would be great.
Yeah, let me move to another room. Just bear with me.
Thank you.
Oh. Okay. Is it better?
Much better, yeah.
I apologize. It wasn't that way yesterday, but they're constructing right outside my window today, and in particular, bad timing. So we were discussing explanations of vote, Rule 88. It's fairly straightforward. The only question that can come up is whether you explain your votes before or after the voting. It depends on the chair and the practice in the committee. In some places, you can ask to speak before or after, and that's your choice. And the presidency or the chair doesn't differentiate. In some committees or different chairs, they say, no, I only want explanations of vote after the vote. And the other thing we mentioned before is only if you're a sponsor, you do not explain your vote because it's already known how you're going to vote for explanations of vote. For the question of rights of reply, I need to find that in the rules that I've left in the other room. But in the meantime, I don't know if you have it there. Right of reply is used to reply to objectionable or offensive statements made by someone in the debate. And either I think normally the practice is at the end of the day in a committee or in the plenary, you can have rights of reply, and the rights of reply are limited to, I believe it's 10 minutes for the first one and 5 minutes the second one. They may have reduced that. You'll have to check the general committee reports. We can ask Kenji about that this afternoon, how the latest practice is on rights of reply. It's Rule 73, if you could find it. It's the last sentence is very briefly stated. The president may accord the right of reply to any member if a speech delivered after he has declared the list of closed makes this desirable. So it's a fairly flexible, not very specifically covered in any detail in the rules. So it's more a matter of practice. The only thing about rights of reply, of course, I mean, the president will and the chair will try to enforce the time limit, because once you have rights of reply going back and forth between hostile continue on and on and on, and it would go over the time limit. So normally the chairs try to be very strict about that to avoid it becoming too much of an unpleasant, controversial issue. The one practice which is not indicated in the rules is that during the general debate, which is not a debate, in fact, it's when you have heads of state address the General Assembly during the general debate. Because during the general debate, you have heads of state, heads of government, ministers of foreign affairs, and permanent representatives, so on and so forth. But the top level there, the heads of state, they don't participate technically in the general debate. They give an address to the General Assembly. That is not subject to a right of reply. What happens is if a head of state says something objectionable, you can circulate a document objecting to what that head of state has said. That's how that is taken care of. Head of government, or foreign minister, fair game. You can do rights of reply. So maybe if you can review, let me get my rules from the other room. Palau, if you can review the questions, and when I come back, I'll ask you to tell me what kind of questions we have to answer.
Okay.
Be right back.
Please, if anybody has any further questions, you can share in the chat.
Okay. Let me see if I can find my
The first
chat.
question, Larry, would be how the chairman is managing to limit speakers in favor of against of the motion for each resolution. Can all speakers have the floor?
If you're not in a procedural motion, but you're rather making speeches or making statements on a proposal, right? If you want to speak on resolution L35, for example, you will have most chairs and secretariats will have a speakers list, and they will announce in their organization of work session and discuss it with the committee that you will have 3 days to take up this item, or you will have 2 days to discuss draft resolutions on this item. And if you want to speak, you better make sure you inform the secretariat right away, as soon as you can, to be put on that speakers list. Because it could, and then the committee agrees to those deadlines. Huh? So if the committee has agreed that you only take 2 days to take up these resolutions, say on disarmament, on a disarmament issue, cluster of items, then you need to get your name in there. If there's time and space, you can always just raise your hand and say, I wish, I'd like to make a comment on that draft resolution. But normally if you have an organized committee, they will set out what days discussion will be had on a particular, on items and on draft proposals.
We also have for Rule 77, which I have in the screen for reference, what is the difference between suspension of a meeting and adjournment of a meeting?
Good question. So suspension is more or less seen as a short duration break. We're suspending the meeting. We'll come back to that same meeting in half an hour, because normally you have meetings in the morning from 10 to 1, and then in the afternoon from 3 to 6. So a suspension is more or less a brief break in one of those sessions. An adjournment of the meeting is we're done with this morning meeting, we adjourn, and we'll meet for the next meeting, which is either that afternoon or the next day or a few days after that. So the suspension is the meeting actually is going to continue on. It's just taking a break, short break. And an adjournment is we're done with this meeting, it's finished, we'll meet next as agreed upon. More or less, that's the agreement. I see a question.
And then we also have, what's the difference between EOPs before and after the vote?
No difference. Maybe people, maybe politically or strategically, if you feel it's important for your cause to have people speak before the vote, because say some delegation has been lobbied from competing sides to either in favor or against a draft resolution, and they've kept quiet, or they may be very influential, and if that particular delegation, if they say I'm going to vote in favor, others will vote in favor also. Then you may want that delegate to speak before the vote, because that may affect the votes. Now that may be wishful thinking. It depends on the item, and it depends on whether or not instructions are given on how to vote, because sometimes you may be given more flexible instructions, or you may be, if you're a member of a particular group, and you may get an instruction, well, whatever the head of the spokesman for the group says is how we should go. So, in some ways, before the vote, tactically, from a political point of view, may be more advantageous, because after the vote, it doesn't matter. You're not influencing anybody. Once the vote is taken, it's over. So before the vote, you may have a chance to influence other voters. That's the only thing I could say. But that's a political, not a legal matter.
And finally, Larry, we also have a question. What's the difference between a UN resolution, a joint statement, and a political declaration?
Uh, well, if the joint statement or the political declaration is adopted in a resolution, there's no difference whatever. But a joint statement by whom? If it's a joint statement by the General Assembly, it's got to be in a resolution.
They give
and
us examples: joint statement on open markets, flow of essential goods, and supply chain connectivity.
I'm not familiar with that. Where does that joint statement come from? Is it a joint statement of foreign ministers meeting somewhere? Or is it a joint statement from a regional group? Or is it a joint statement of ambassadors? Or is it a joint statement that has been approved by the General Assembly? Then it has to be, it would be a resolution. Same thing with a political declaration. I didn't mention it before, but sometimes these declarations are all called solemn declarations, so on. And you have declarations adopted by the General Assembly. But legally, there's no difference between a solemn declaration and a regular UN resolution. Politically or policy-wise, declarations are given greater political weight. They are often by consensus. They often have, particularly in the legal field, you may have made pronouncements of what international legal principles or interpretations of the charter, things like that. From the legal point of view, a resolution is a resolution, whether it's adopted unanimously or by only one vote. It all has the same legal basis. And by the way, in this, the term of solemn declaration, I'm always wondering, why do they have to say solemn? If you don't say solemn, does that make any other declaration frivolous? So it's a matter of verbiage and political trying to heighten the importance of what is being declared. Yes, a joint statement is a statement by member states to support a common cause. So that's a statement by those members. Anything that's a resolution is a statement by the General Assembly, by the members of the General Assembly. Now, there has been, and from the very beginning, there's been a discussion, well, what if you're in a minority and the General Assembly has taken a decision? That doesn't speak for you, but that is made clear in statements made in the records of the General Assembly. So if you have a resolution, the General Assembly approves such and such, that's true. The General Assembly has adopted that by a majority, but you can always say, well, the General Assembly may have approved it, a majority may have approved it, but my government has not. So any other questions? Let me see. I have the questions in front of me.
I think that was the last one for now.
I do have a question, the difference really between adjournment, we covered that. Okay. All votes by every country on each resolution is available in document 49 of each session. That was from Mr. Buttigieg from Malta. Okay. Okay, I guess we're, at least for the time being. Any other questions? Be sure and send them in. What's our time?
11:20.
11:20. Okay, we have 10 minutes left. We intend to break at 11:30, a little earlier, because we need to reconvene at 1 o'clock when Kenji Nakano will be with us to deal with decision-making in the time of COVID-19. And some of you may be very involved in some of that discussions. Obviously, everything I've been talking about today are assuming a normal voting situation or a normal decision-making situation or normal meetings where you're physically present in the room. And things are obviously quite different as we speak today. If you see any other questions that crop up as I'm sort of winding up, Paleo, if you could let me know.
Once a resolution is adopted, what department of the UN carries out that resolution? We have that question from Montbert.
Yeah, that depends on who's in charge of the substantive item. So in the disarmament, in the first committee, it's probably the political department. It all depends on who is there. There's always a secretariat unit that is responsible for following sort of each agenda item, and therefore each resolution that is adopted under that item. And you will know that from the committees or from the plenary, because in fact, once you submit a draft resolution, it will go through that substantive department on its way to the editors, so that the substantive department is always aware of what's going on and what proposals are being made. Because you may have in those resolutions requests of the Secretary General. You could have for example, a request of the Secretary General to submit a questionnaire on the advisability of a nuclear weapon-free zone somewhere. And then that secretariat in the disarmament department unit will be responsible for doing that. So they would want to know that that idea is being floated in case they have any idea. So the rules, as we've said before, are tools. Some people call them weapons, but you should be aware of them, and also know in your mission who is in charge of rules, if anybody. And hopefully, if you have a legal advisor in your mission, or if they come for the General Assembly, they would be aware of how the rules operate and could give you advice. Sometimes you will see legal advisors that normally are in the 6th committee, all of a sudden in the 3rd committee or the 1st committee, or wherever there are votes, in order to advise on procedural matters. And the Secretariat, as I said before, the Office of Legal Affairs, Office of Legal Counsel, they give procedural advice to presiding officers and to secretaries of. You can also consult them, not with asking them for advice how to handle a particular issue, but on precedents, as we started this morning, of how things have been interpreted in the past. So if you're new and you look at Rule 74 and you say, 74 doesn't say no action, where did that come from? Or can I use Rule 74 on a paragraph or on a few words? Or can I use Rule 74 on a procedural motion? Then you can ask the legal office, because they know how these rules have been applied in practice. So that's not giving you advice what to do. That's just telling you how this has worked, operated on the ground in the past. Have there been legal opinions on a given matter? That you should feel free to go to the Office of Legal Counsel and the person there in charge of, and to seek advice as to how things have been done in the past. Otherwise, I think we're basically finished with a sort of a broad overview of the rules. We haven't talked about elections, which are in some ways subject to another whole, sometimes subject of another whole lecture or training session, because elections, of course, can get very complicated, and it's a secret ballot as opposed to the voting in the General Assembly on resolutions and decisions, where everything is out in the open and you have public votes. You don't have secret ballots for draft resolutions. Some organizations have that, but not in the UN. From the very beginning, the idea was open voting, public voting. Whether it's recorded or not, at least even if it's by show of hands, you see how. Any other questions, Palayo, that we've seen?
We do have a question. It's if a private citizen has lobbied their government to take up an issue in the draft resolution, are they able to sit in for the vote? Will they be involved?
Not unless they're a member of the delegation with the credentials signed by foreign minister, head of state, head of government. No, the public is not involved, is not invited onto the floor of the General Assembly. Members of the public or NGOs that have been advocating their government to take a position. And if they're very pleased because they've been successful, they can be in the public or they can be guests of the delegation in a certain area of the hall. But that has to be handled by the delegation, and who would request a secretariat for guest passes to be seated in a certain place in the General Assembly Hall to observe the adoption or the speeches and so on and so forth. Delegations do have the right to get guests, unless in the time of COVID or there may be other security arrangements. But from point of view principle, the delegations can invite guests, but there may, as I said, there may be security and certainly health regulations about that these days. That I don't know. But if you're a member of the delegation and are fully accredited and have a pass which has D on it, you can go onto the floor. So I hear there's another one. Is there an expiration date? Is that it? Let me see.
Yes, that's the last one. Is there an expiration date for UN Security Council resolution in terms of implementation?
That's up to the council's and the resolution's language and the history. If you're talking about peacekeeping, for example, peacekeeping operations almost all have an ending date. So, for example, in the month of June, you had a lot of peacekeeping operations that had to be renewed. And sometimes they're renewed for, a year, 12 months. Sometimes they're renewed for 3 months. Sometimes they're renewed for 30 days in order to get more to have more consultations. So those are fairly easy when you've got a termination that's already set into the resolution itself. Otherwise, it's up to if the resolution doesn't indicate a termination, expiration date, it just continues. Normally, a resolution will have follow-ups, will have reports, either in a sanctions committee or from the Secretary General or from a working group, how the resolution is being implemented, how is it going? And if it's not going well, then the matter comes back to the council to tighten up implementation. That's as I understand it in the Security Council. So, any other questions? I'll now come back. And I apologize for our noisy construction. So are we at the 11:30 mark?
Yes, we are right now just 11:30.
Okay, well, very good. Well, we have one more discussion. How to deactivate, end an agenda. Is that right? How to end an agenda item from being discussed from now on. I think Sonia discussed that somewhat in her presentation. As I said, there was a period of when they were looking at efficiency and trying to lighten the load of the agenda, which is fairly heavy, that if a matter is not discussed in a number of years, it falls away, unless a sponsor comes back and asks that it be maintained. But otherwise, what you could do is you make sure that in the resolution, there's no indication of it being inscribed in the provisional agenda of the next year. Normally, that's at the end of almost many resolutions, that at the end, it will say decides to inscribe this matter in the provisional agenda of the following session or in 2 years' time. That keeps it alive. So if you want to kill it, get rid of that paragraph. And the other way is to make sure you don't have any requests from the Secretary General for any reports. Because even if you don't have a request for the inscription, if the Secretary General or a working group has been mandated to do a report on it for the next year, it's going to be back on the agenda, because how else is it going to be discussed? So there are ways to do that, and it's probably a good idea to talk to GA Affairs on that. a number of items as we began this whole training. If the items are the bright ideas of a particular delegation or a leader, I'm retired, I can say those things. Then those items, that government, if that government has really, that's been a prime idea of that government, it's hard to get rid of that agenda item because that government will always want to keep talking about it, or at least put it on the agenda, even if it's not being talked about, as a matter of leverage or as a political matter to make a point. So that's the problem with just dropping agenda items easily. Agenda items almost always come from somewhere, and most of the time they come from delegations, if they're not reports of normal UN bodies. And those delegations may or may not want to continue those items as a matter of pride or political strategy. Okay? Any other questions? Otherwise, keep them, if any crop up over this early lunch hour, be sure and bring them back for our final session with Kenji at 1 o'clock, when we'll discuss how things are working in the era of the pandemic, and also some of these matters we discussed. I suggested you raise with Kenji when he comes. Okay, if there are no other comments, I guess we're adjourned then. Okay, thank you very much for joining. And again, I apologize for the the noisy background. Thank you very much. See you at 1 o'clock.
Thank you, everyone. We'll be using the same link as this morning.
Okay.